At the start of the COVID outbreak, economists warned house prices could fall by 10 to 30%. How wrong they were. This year, house prices have risen at the highest rate in at least 3 decades. $9 trillion is now sunk into Australian homes, 3 times the entire pool of money in superannuation. Housing has become the great divide between the young and the old, the well-off and the less so.
I'm surprised there isn't more anger among younger people about the way in which the housing market has been rigged against them and their life chances by their parents' generation.
And it goes, we sell. Welcome home, we are sold you at $1,300,000.
Tonight on 4Corners, the extraordinary cost of home ownership in Australia. We take the pulse of prices and hear from people frozen out of the market as we investigate what's causing the housing affordability crisis.
For a majority of Australians, the property market has been an escalator to ever greater levels of personal wealth. And if you've been able to get on that escalator at the bottom, you've done exceptionally well over the following 30 years. If you've been able to hop onto it at different points during that period, you've also shared in those gains. But if you're part of an increasing minority of Australians who haven't been able to get the first foot on that escalator, you've missed out.
Since the early 1990s, house prices have risen about 550%. Home ownership's now fallen to its lowest level since the mid-1950s.
What's really striking is the decline in the home ownership rate among people under the age of 45, which at the 2016 census was lower than it had been at the census of 1954. And I suspect when the 2021 results come out, that the home ownership rate among younger Australian adults, that is, say, between their 20s and mid-30s, will be lower than it was at the census of 1947.
And the affordability problem has spread beyond the biggest cities. Housing in Hobart used to be cheap, no longer.
It now costs more to buy an average priced house in Hobart, population 220,000, than it does in Adelaide, Brisbane or Perth, which are cities that have between 5 and 10 times as many people as Hobart does. But at the same time, average wages in Tasmania are about 15% below those on the mainland. So the difficulty that people face in getting into housing in Tasmania has deteriorated quite dramatically. I've often said over the last 15 years that I'm surprised there isn't more anger among younger people about the way in which the housing market has been rigged against them and their life chances by their parents' generation. But it would seem that instead of taking to the streets and demanding change in Australia's housing system, Australia's younger adults are taking out their revenge on their parents' generation by refusing to move out of their homes.
At the end of World War II, only about half of Australian households owned a home. Then government made lifting home ownership a national priority.
Our choice on December the 10th is between a socialist government and a liberal government.
Prime Minister Menzies saw it as a bulwark against communism, applauding the instinct to have a little piece of earth with a house and garden to call our own.
In the Menzies era, they started out by making loans available from the Commonwealth to the states, which built housing for returning soldiers and various other lower income households to get into home purchase.
And the home ownership rate rose by about 20 percentage points, from 52% at the 1947 census to a peak of 72% at the census of 1966. And the reason why we were able to achieve such an extraordinary increase in home ownership was because governments focused on boosting the supply of housing and didn't do anything beyond running a high immigration program to inflate the demand for housing. In particular, governments built quite a lot of houses themselves, either for rent to people on low incomes or after the election of the Menzies government for sale to people who had modest incomes but not quite high enough to qualify for loans from the private savings banks.
I think in many ways that was a sort of golden era in which Australia was seen as a place that for people living here or moving here, migrating here, it was actually a realistic possibility to work hard, save money, buy a piece of land and build a house. It was actually attainable for most people. So housing was actually a method of attaining equality in that era.
No longer. These days you can't escape the headlines about crazy house prices. Wages can't possibly keep up. It's creating a kind of mania where people think if I don't buy now, I'll never be able to. Generous tax concessions for property investors, including the halving of the capital gains tax under the Howard government, have also played a part.
And what, of course, that's done has been to put investors in competition with would-be home buyers for what's a limited supply of housing. People who might otherwise have been able to buy can't afford to do so in competition with investors who get their interest costs subsidised by other taxpayers through negative gearing and who pay less tax on the capital gains they ultimately intend to make than the tax people pay on their wage and salary income.
Labor took a policy to wind back these tax concessions to the last 2 federal elections and lost. Now it's dropped the plan. To compete against investors and break into the market, first home buyers are having to take on eye-watering debts. Fearing soaring housing debt could destabilise the economy, regulators have intervened. Banks must now ensure borrowers have a bigger buffer against rate rises. But that won't help first home buyers. For decades, both sides of politics have responded to concerns about affordability by offering grants and subsidies to first home buyers, a strategy embraced by the Morrison government. Yet the Coalition MP chairing Parliament's latest housing affordability inquiry concedes such measures often make things worse.
And what that has ultimately resulted in is that we have forced up prices in the major markets. So the beneficiary has not been the home buyer, it's actually been the home seller.
And on every occasion during the past 30 years when it seemed as though house prices might fall, governments have intervened by providing ever larger grants to would-be first home buyers on ever more generous eligibility criteria, and the Reserve Bank has cut interest rates to, in every cycle, new record lows. And the result of those steps has been to reignite the property price fire on every occasion when it's looked like going out.
The heat in the market extends to regional areas, especially the coast.
Since the onset of COVID, there's been a significant reversal of the long-standing population flows from regional centres to cities. Instead, people are moving in the other direction. And that's the main reason why, since the onset of COVID, property prices in regional areas have risen at a faster rate than in the capital cities, and rents even more so.
Whether politicians will have the will to tackle affordability is another question, when millions of Australians accumulate so much wealth by doing nothing other than owning real estate.
The stock of Australian dwellings is worth $9 trillion. And if you create interventions that reduce the value, you are wiping trillions of dollars of value off the balance sheets of Australian homeowners. Now, I don't see any political appetite for that. Politicians
shed crocodile tears for the difficulties faced by young, aspiring home buyers. There's an awful lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth by politicians of all political persuasions as to how difficult that's become. Yet politicians keep doing the same things. You know, it kind of reminds you of Einstein's definition of madness, that's doing the same thing over and over again, expecting that this time you'll get a different result.
Unless things change, Australia is on course to become a more unequal society, with a growing gulf between the wealth and the lives of those who own homes and those who never will.